In the quiet streets of Anaheim Hills, a respected judge's life unraveled in a single gunshot. A marriage torn by secrets, a night clouded in alcohol, and a courtroom battle that gripped a community. This is the shocking case of Judge Jeffrey Ferguson and the wife he killed. Anaheim Hills, California, is known for its quiet, tree-lined streets, upscale homes, and a sense of safety that many residents take for granted. Nestled in the rolling hills of Orange County, it's the kind of community where neighbors wave from their driveways and trouble feels far away. But in August of 2023, that sense of peace was shattered by a crime so startling that it drew national attention. The fatal shooting of 65-year-old Cheryl Ferguson, allegedly at the hands of her husband, 74-year-old Judge Jeffrey Ferguson. It was a case that would shake the local legal community, not only because of the brutal nature of the crime, but because of who the accused was, a man who had spent decades upholding the law, now standing accused of breaking it in the worst possible way. Jeffrey Ferguson was no stranger to the court system. A respected figure in the Orange County legal world, he had served as a prosecutor for many years before being elected to the Superior Court bench in 2015. His career had been marked by high-profile trials, his deep knowledge of the law, and his familiarity with firearms, both as a collector and as someone who had handled them extensively. To his colleagues, he was intelligent, witty, and sometimes outspoken. But behind the professional accolades, there were hints of strain in his personal life, tensions at home that had grown over the years, quietly brewing beneath the surface. Cheryl Ferguson was described by friends and neighbors as warm, stylish, and devoted to her family. She and Jeffrey had been married for nearly 3 decades, raising 2 sons together. Their younger son, Philip, was 22 years old in the summer of 2023, home from college during the break. To outsiders, the Fergusons seemed like an established couple with all the trappings of success, a comfortable home, professional accomplishments, and 2 grown children. But inside that home, disagreements over money, trust, and personal history had left their mark on the relationship. The evening of August 3, 2023, began like many others. The Fergusons went out for dinner at a local Mexican restaurant. It was a warm summer night, and they ordered drinks, more than a few. Witnesses later recalled Jeffrey having multiple alcoholic beverages, including beer and rum mixed with soda, on top of what he'd already had before arriving. Cheryl also drank, but those who knew Jeffrey would later say that his tolerance had changed with age, and alcohol often loosened his temper. After dinner, the couple returned to their Anaheim Hills home. Philip was there, spending time with them as they settled in for the evening. They put on the television and began watching episodes of the critically acclaimed series Breaking Bad. The show's dark themes of crime and moral downfall may have been coincidental, but in hindsight, the choice of entertainment seemed eerily symbolic of what was about to unfold. At first, it was an ordinary family night, the TV murmuring in the background, conversation flowing. But soon, a familiar topic arose, one that had long been a source of conflict: money. According to Philip, the argument escalated quickly. Voices rose. Accusations were exchanged. And then, the subject shifted to something far more personal, an old family wound. Years earlier, the Fergusons had discovered that their older son, Kevin, was not Jeffrey's biological child. This revelation, long buried beneath the routines of daily life, had deeply hurt Jeffrey and had created a lasting rift between him and Cheryl. That night, the old resentment came back into focus. As the exchange grew more heated, Philip found himself caught in the middle, watching his parents' temper spiral. Cheryl, visibly frustrated, made a remark that would later become a haunting detail in the case. According to testimony, she said something along the lines of, "Why don't you point a real gun at me?" It was a taunt, perhaps born out of anger, but it hit a nerve with Jeffrey, a man who was never far from a firearm. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but would be dissected for years. Jeffrey reached for a Glock .40 caliber pistol he kept in an ankle holster. He later claimed he intended to place it on the coffee table, but as he moved, the gun fired. The bullet struck Cheryl in the midsection. Philip watched in shock as his mother collapsed, the television still playing in the background. The scene that followed was chaos. Philip, acting on instinct, lunged at his father, tackling him in an attempt to disarm him. He succeeded, wresting the pistol away and calling 911. He also tried to perform CPR on his mother, desperate to save her life. Jeffrey, meanwhile, did something unexpected. He took out his phone and sent a text message to his court clerk and bailiff. The message was short and shocking. "I just lost it. I just shot my wife. I won't be in tomorrow. I will be in custody. I'm so sorry." When police arrived, Jeffrey was visibly emotional. According to officers, he told them, "I killed her, convict my ass. I did it." His words were raw, but his explanation was already forming. He insisted that the shooting was an accident, the result of a slip or a fumble as he tried to move the gun. The combination of alcohol, an old shoulder injury, and a heated argument, that, he said, was what had led to his wife's death. The investigation began immediately. Officers noted the layout of the home, the position of the gun, and the evidence of a struggle between father and son. Neighbors, hearing sirens and seeing flashing lights, stepped outside, whispering in disbelief as word spread that the man in handcuffs was not just any resident, but a sitting Orange County judge. In the hours that followed, the pieces of the evening were assembled through witness statements and physical evidence. Philip's account of the events matched what little could be seen on the home's security cameras, which captured the moments before and after the shooting, but not the shot itself. Friends and colleagues of the Fergusons were contacted, and the portrait of their marriage became more complicated. There were stories of previous arguments, some loud enough for neighbors to hear. There were also accounts of Jeffrey's fondness for alcohol and his tendency to keep guns close at hand. For the Anaheim Hills community, the crime was a shock not just for its violence, but for the breach of trust it represented. Judges are symbols of authority, fairness, and stability. To see one accused of such an act was unsettling, raising questions about the pressures of the job, the fragility of personal relationships, and how easily things can unravel behind closed doors. By the next day, the story had made headlines across Southern California. The Los Angeles Times, the Orange County Register, and national outlets all carried variations of the same headline: Orange County judge arrested in wife's fatal shooting. The courthouse where Jeffrey had presided was buzzing with speculation. Lawyers who had appeared before him traded stories about his courtroom style, his intelligence, and his sometimes blunt manner. Some expressed disbelief, while others admitted that they weren't entirely surprised, citing past remarks that hinted at tension at home. In those first days, the official narrative was still taking shape. Prosecutors were careful in their statements, noting only that the case involved domestic violence, a firearm, and alcohol. The defense, speaking briefly, suggested that the shooting was not intentional and that Jeffrey was devastated by what had happened. Meanwhile, Philip was grappling with the unimaginable, his mother dead, his father in jail, and himself the lone witness to a tragedy that had unfolded in seconds but would cast a shadow over the rest of his life. The case was already drawing intense public interest. Here was a man who had spent decades deciding the fates of others, now awaiting his own. The contrast was stark. The black robes of the courtroom replaced by an orange jail uniform, the commanding presence behind the bench replaced by a subdued figure in handcuffs. For many, the image of a judge accused of murder was difficult to reconcile with the role he once played in the community. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the Fergusons' marriage and Jeffrey's state of mind leading up to that night. Financial strain, personal grievances, and unresolved betrayals had all combined into a volatile mix. The question of intent, whether the shooting was an accident or a deliberate act, would become the central focus of the legal battle ahead. But in the immediate aftermath, one thing was clear. A long and respected legal career had come to an abrupt and devastating end, and the lives of everyone connected to the Fergusons had been changed forever. This was only the beginning. The events of that August night were just the first chapter in a story that would unfold over months, through court hearings, legal arguments, and the slow, methodical process of justice. The road ahead would be filled with conflicting accounts, expert testimony, and emotional confrontations. But for now, Anaheim Hills was left with a grim reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in the most seemingly secure corners of the law. The days following the shooting were a blur of legal motions, media coverage, and behind-the-scenes preparation for what was already shaping up to be a high-profile trial. In Anaheim Hills, the Ferguson home was no longer just another house on the block. It was a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the property while detectives went in and out, gathering evidence. Cameras from local news outlets were stationed on the street, their lenses trained on the front door. For neighbors, the quiet cul-de-sac had turned into a spectacle, each new development discussed in hushed tones over backyard fences. Inside the Orange County District Attorney's office, prosecutors weighed their options. The facts were disturbing. A respected judge had shot his wife in their living room after a night of heavy drinking. But there were complexities. There was no clear premeditation, and Jeffrey Ferguson claimed the shooting was accidental. The legal team would have to decide whether to charge him with murder or a lesser offense. After reviewing the evidence, they moved forward with the most serious charge available, second-degree murder, along with enhancements for using a firearm and causing death. Jeffrey was booked into the Orange County Jail, his bail set at $1 million. In court, he appeared in a standard orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the black judicial robe he had worn for years. His once confident posture was replaced by a subdued demeanor, though he still managed to greet his defense team with quiet familiarity. He retained experienced criminal defense attorneys, who immediately began crafting a strategy built around the argument that the shooting was a tragic accident, not a crime of intent. In the weeks that followed, more details of that night emerged through court filings and witness statements. Philip Ferguson, the couple's younger son, had given a detailed account to investigators. His statement painted a vivid picture of the argument that escalated from a discussion about finances into a deeply personal confrontation. He described how the tension had been simmering for years, especially after the family learned that Kevin, his older brother, was not biologically Jeffrey's son. According to Philip, this revelation had been a source of constant friction between his parents, a wound that never fully healed. Philip also described his father's drinking habits. That night, Jeffrey had been drinking steadily, starting before they even left for the restaurant. At dinner, he continued, ordering multiple alcoholic beverages. By the time they returned home, he was visibly intoxicated. The argument began almost immediately, with Philip sitting nearby. He recalled his mother's frustration building until she made the fateful remark, challenging her husband to point a real gun at her. What happened in the seconds that followed, Philip told investigators, would replay in his mind forever. His father reaching for the Glock, the sudden report of the gunshot, and his mother collapsing to the floor. The prosecution's case began to take shape. They would portray Jeffrey as a man with a quick temper, a history of heavy drinking, and a readiness to use firearms. They pointed to his immediate actions after the shooting, not rushing to his wife's aid, but instead sending a text to his court staff admitting what he had done. They also highlighted his alleged statement to police, "I killed her, convict my ass, I did it," as evidence of consciousness of guilt. The defense, however, was equally determined. They focused on Jeffrey's lifelong familiarity with firearms, arguing that he knew how to handle them safely and would not intentionally fire at his wife. They claimed that the shooting was the result of a physical mishap, a combination of his shoulder injury and intoxication causing him to fumble the gun. They emphasized that the couple's argument, though heated, was not unusual for them, and that there was no evidence Jeffrey had planned to kill Cheryl. As pre-trial hearings began, the media presence intensified. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, ready to capture each appearance. Former colleagues, lawyers, and court staff members who had once worked alongside Jeffrey were called as potential witnesses, their own reputations now tied to the unfolding scandal. The courthouse was abuzz with speculation. Some believed Jeffrey's explanation. Others saw it as a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility. In March 2025, the case went to trial for the first time. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, friends, and members of the public curious to witness the fall of a man who had once presided from the bench. The prosecution opened with a stark narrative. A respected judge had lost control during a drunken argument, and used his gun to end his wife's life. They laid out the timeline of that night, from the drinks at dinner to the gunshot in the living room, and played audio of the 911 call Philip had made in the frantic aftermath. Philip took the stand, his voice steady but laced with emotion. He recounted the argument, the shot, and the moments after, when he tackled his father to the ground and wrestled the gun away. He described the desperate attempt to save his mother, the blood, and the realization that nothing could be done. His testimony was some of the most powerful in the trial, drawing the jury into the intimate and devastating details of what had happened. The defense countered with their own witnesses, including firearms experts who explained how a gun could discharge accidentally under certain conditions. They argued that Jeffrey's age, combined with his shoulder injury, made it plausible that he lost control of the weapon. They also emphasized his years of service in the legal system, painting him as a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law and had no history of violence toward his wife. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations dragged on, the panel reviewing evidence, replaying testimony, and debating the fine line between an accident and murder. In the end, they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. 11 jurors favored conviction, but one held out, convinced that reasonable doubt remained. The judge declared a mistrial, and the case was set for a retrial. For Jeffrey, the mistrial was a temporary reprieve, but it came at a cost. He remained out on bail, but under strict conditions, his legal fees mounting. For the prosecution, the outcome was frustrating but not surprising. High-profile cases involving well-known defendants often proved difficult to resolve in a single trial. They immediately began preparing for the second round, refining their arguments and considering adjustments to their strategy. The retrial was scheduled for April 2025. By now, public interest had only grown. The mistrial had left unanswered questions, and both sides were determined to secure a definitive outcome. In the weeks leading up to jury selection, the case was the subject of countless news segments, legal analysis shows, and online commentary. The stakes were high. For the prosecution, a conviction would affirm their view of the case. For the defense, an acquittal would mean redemption for a man whose life and career had been destroyed by the allegations. When the retrial began, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution tightened their presentation, focusing on the most compelling evidence: Philip's testimony, the text message Jeffrey sent after the shooting, and his own words to police at the scene. They sought to portray him not as a tragic figure caught in an accident, but as a man who had made a reckless, irreversible choice in a moment of anger. The defense, for their part, doubled down on the accident theory. They brought in medical experts to explain Jeffrey's shoulder injury in detail and firearms specialists to demonstrate how such a mishap could occur. They also tried to humanize Jeffrey, reminding jurors of his long service in the legal system and the deep remorse he felt over his wife's death. As witnesses testified and evidence was presented, the jury was once again confronted with the conflicting narratives. On one side, a portrait of a man who had let alcohol and anger dictate his actions. On the other, the image of a husband whose life had been undone by a tragic split-second mistake. The line between these interpretations was razor-thin, and the outcome would depend on which version the jurors found most credible. In this second trial, there would be no room for compromise. The case was moving toward a verdict that would determine not only Jeffrey Ferguson's future, but also how the public would remember the night of August 3, 2023. The jury listened intently, aware of the weight of their responsibility. The moment of judgment was drawing closer, but for now, both sides could only wait as the trial moved steadily toward its conclusion. The second trial moved faster than the first, both sides determined to avoid the missteps and delays that had stretched the earlier proceedings. By now, every juror had heard of the case before stepping into the courtroom, but each swore under oath that they could remain impartial. The prosecution's strategy was to strip away any ambiguity and present the clearest possible narrative. Jeffrey Ferguson, intoxicated and angry, made the deliberate choice to pull the trigger. They relied heavily on Philip Ferguson's account, treating it as the most reliable version of events. His testimony was calm, but carried the weight of someone who had lived through the worst night of his life. The image of a son tackling his father to stop further harm was seared into the minds of the jury. The prosecution also replayed the 911 call in full. Philip's voice could be heard, urgent and desperate, telling the dispatcher that his father had shot his mother. In the background, faint but unmistakable, Jeffrey's voice cut through, emotional, at times slurred, admitting he had done it. The recording brought the jury directly into the chaos of that night. Prosecutors paired it with a damning text message Jeffrey had sent to his court staff, framing it as a spontaneous confession sent before he could craft an excuse. They argued that these two pieces of evidence, the call and the text, captured the truth before the defense's accident narrative could take shape. The defense worked to undermine that certainty. They reminded jurors that no one had actually seen Jeffrey pull the trigger with the intent to fire. They brought out the Glock in question, demonstrating its weight and mechanism. Firearms experts explained how, in rare circumstances, a misstep could cause an unintended discharge. Jeffrey's medical records were introduced, showing a history of shoulder problems and surgeries. His attorneys walked the jury through a scenario in which he attempted to set the gun down. His arm gave way, and the weapon fired without warning. They also painted a portrait of the Fergusons' marriage that was more complex than the prosecution's portrayal. Yes, they argued, there were tensions. But there was also deep history, shared accomplishments, and no pattern of physical violence. Jeffrey, they said, was devastated by Cheryl's death and would carry the guilt forever. The defense's aim was not to erase the tragedy, but to reframe it, from a crime of intent to a terrible accident compounded by alcohol. The jury deliberated for about 7 hours over 2 days. The weight of the decision was clear. A guilty verdict would likely mean Jeffrey would spend the rest of his life in prison. A not guilty verdict would free him, but leave many believing he had escaped justice. When the jurors returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Jeffrey sat at the defense table, hands clasped, eyes forward. Philip was in the gallery, flanked by friends and relatives. The foreperson read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder, with enhancements for the use of a firearm and for causing death. The words landed heavily in the room. Jeffrey closed his eyes briefly, then turned toward his son. Courtroom protocol allowed him a moment to stand and embrace Philip. They hugged tightly, Jeffrey whispering, "It's okay. Be strong." Then, without further delay, he was handcuffed and led out by deputies. Outside the courthouse, the prosecution addressed the media. They emphasized that no one was above the law, not even a judge, and that Cheryl Ferguson had been denied her right to live out her life because of her husband's actions. The defense expressed disappointment, but maintained that the shooting had been accidental. They said they would consider an appeal, though they acknowledged the uphill battle they faced. The conviction marked the end of a nearly 2-year legal saga, but the story did not end there. The sentencing phase was set for June 13, 2025, and it promised to be just as emotionally charged as the trial itself. Prosecutors sought the maximum penalty, 40 years to life, arguing that the severity of the crime, coupled with the betrayal of public trust, warranted the harshest possible sentence. The defense urged leniency, pointing to Jeffrey's age, his decades of public service, and his lack of prior criminal history. In preparation for sentencing, victim impact statements were collected from Cheryl's friends and family. They described her as a vibrant woman whose warmth and energy touched everyone she met. Some spoke of the void her death had left, the milestones she would never see, and the deep pain that still lingered. Philip's statement was perhaps the most complex. He had been both a witness against his father and, in many ways, his last remaining family. His words were measured, acknowledging his loss, but also the complicated bond that still existed between them. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was again filled to capacity. The judge presiding over the case noted the unusual circumstances. A judge sentencing another judge for murder. When Jeffrey was given the opportunity to speak, he addressed the court in a subdued voice. He expressed sorrow for Cheryl's death, insisting again that it had been an accident. He thanked his supporters, acknowledged his failings, and said he would accept whatever punishment the court deemed appropriate. The judge delivered the sentence: 40 years to life in state prison. It was, in practical terms, a life sentence for a man of Jeffrey's age. The judge cited the gravity of taking a human life, the use of a firearm in a domestic setting, and the need to hold public officials to the highest standard. With that, the case of People versus Jeffrey Ferguson was officially closed. In the weeks after sentencing, the public's attention began to fade. The media moved on to other stories, and the Ferguson house in Anaheim Hills eventually changed hands. But for those closest to the case, the impact would never fade. Philip carried the memory of that night, the argument, the gunshot, the desperate attempt to save his mother, with him into adulthood. The legal community in Orange County was left with a scar, a reminder that personal turmoil can spill into public tragedy, even for those sworn to uphold the law. Jeffrey was transferred to a state prison facility, his days now defined by the routines of incarceration. The man who once decided the fate of others now lived under constant supervision, his authority stripped away. He spent his time reading, corresponding with his legal team, and, according to some reports, working in the prison's law library. Whether he would ever admit full responsibility for his wife's death remained uncertain. The case became a subject of discussion in legal ethics courses and true crime forums alike. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing alcohol, firearms, and unresolved personal grievances. For others, it was a sobering reminder that even the most respected figures can be undone by a single irreversible act. It also sparked conversations about domestic violence, the role of mental and emotional strain in long-term relationships, and how the justice system handles cases involving its own members. In Anaheim Hills, life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of that August night lingered. Neighbors remembered the flashing lights, the swarm of reporters, and the realization that something unthinkable had happened just down the street. For the local legal community, the name Jeffrey Ferguson would forever be linked not to his years on the bench, but to the crime that ended his career and his freedom. The story of Jeffrey and Cheryl Ferguson is one that defies easy conclusions. It is at once a personal tragedy, a legal drama, and a study in how quickly lives can unravel. It began as an argument in a living room and ended in a life sentence, leaving behind unanswered questions and lasting grief. For those who followed the case from start to finish, the final image is unshakable. A veteran judge, once a symbol of justice, led away in chains, convicted of the very crime he had spent his life condemning.
A celebrated judge, a dying marriage, and a single gunshot in a quiet Quebec condo. Was it a tragic suicide, or a calculated murder by the man sworn to uphold the law? The truth behind Jacques Delisle's fall will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. In the heart of Quebec City, a story began to unfold that would shake the foundations of Canada's legal system. It centered around a man who had spent his life interpreting the law, commanding respect in courtrooms, and setting precedents in the halls of justice. Jacques Delisle, a retired judge of the Quebec Court of Appeal, was no ordinary citizen. By the time of his retirement, he was in his late 70s, a respected jurist who had climbed to the top tier of Canada's judiciary. His reputation was that of a disciplined, intelligent, and authoritative figure. Yet behind the prestige, the reality of his personal life was unraveling in ways no one outside his home could see. At the center of this private storm was his wife, Marie-Nicole Rainville. She was in her mid to late 70s, a homemaker who had once been active and independent, but whose health had been in steep decline. A debilitating stroke had left her partially paralyzed. The right side of her body was weakened, her mobility was severely limited, and her independence was stripped away. Tasks that once seemed trivial now required assistance, and her world had shrunk to the confines of their condominium. The stroke not only changed her physical condition but also altered the dynamics of their marriage. She relied heavily on Jacques for her daily needs, and the strain was mutual. From the outside, their life together seemed stable, an older couple living quietly in Quebec City. But beneath the surface, their marriage had been under pressure for some time. Jacques had begun an affair with a younger woman, This relationship was not fleeting or hidden in his mind. It was an escape, a contrast to the duties and limitations he faced at home. The emotional gap between husband and wife widened, and the obligations of caregiving seemed to weigh heavier on him with each passing day. By November 2009, tensions were reaching a point from which there would be no return. On the morning of November 12th, the quiet routine of their household was shattered. In the condominium they shared, Marie-Nicole Rainville was found dead. She had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head. The weapon was a pistol owned by the couple, and Jacques told police that it had been a suicide. According to his account, her declining health and her depression had driven her to take her own life. At first glance, the story had a tragic logic. A physically impaired woman, dependent on her spouse, might have felt trapped by her condition. But for investigators, something about the scene felt wrong. The first layer of doubt arose from the physical evidence. The position of the gun, the angle of the shot, and the way her body was found did not align with the typical patterns of a self-inflicted wound. The trajectory was suspicious. If she had truly fired the weapon herself, the ballistics and residue should have told a consistent story, but they didn't. Police began asking more questions. They noted that Jacques' account of events had small but significant inconsistencies. His explanation of the moments leading up to the shooting, the details about where he was, and how he found her all left gaps that could not easily be closed. Investigators learned about the couple's strained marriage and about the younger woman with whom Jacques had been involved. What began as an apparent suicide was taking shape as a possible homicide. Forensic specialists were brought in to examine the evidence with precision. They studied the gunshot residue, the bullet's path, and the position of the weapon when fired. Their conclusions pointed away from suicide. The angle suggested that the fatal shot had been delivered from a position that would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, for Marie-Nicole to achieve herself, especially considering her partial paralysis. The residue patterns also suggested the weapon was fired at close range by another person. These findings were critical. They shifted the nature of the investigation from a suicide inquiry to a homicide case. The police now believed they had a victim and a suspect, one who had the means, the opportunity, and, importantly, a motive. That motive, they argued, was multifaceted. The burden of caring for a disabled spouse, the desire to be with another woman, and the possibility of freeing himself from the life he no longer wanted. In 2010, the investigation led to formal charges. Jacques Delisle was arrested and accused of first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the province and the country. Never before in Canadian history had a judge been charged with murder, let alone a judge from such a high court. The legal community was stunned, and the public's interest in the case surged. The idea that someone who had long represented the law could be accused of breaking it in the most serious way possible was more than scandal. It was unprecedented. The prosecution began assembling their case with a clear narrative. Jacques Delisle had planned to kill his wife. They emphasized that this was not a crime of passion but one of calculation. They would present forensic evidence to undermine the suicide claim and paint a picture of a man who saw his wife's death as a solution to his personal entanglements. The defense prepared their own version of events. Their argument was straightforward. This was a tragedy, but not a crime. They asserted that Marie-Nicole had been despondent, that her limited mobility and declining health had eroded her will to live, and that her death was self-inflicted. They sought to discredit the Crown's forensic experts and maintain that there was no definitive proof that Jacques had pulled the trigger. As the case moved toward trial, both sides understood the stakes. For the Crown, this was about securing justice for a victim who could not speak for herself. For the defense, it was about dismantling a narrative built on what they considered circumstantial evidence and expert interpretation. The public waited as the proceedings inched forward, fascinated by the unlikely figure at the center of it all. This was not a career criminal or a desperate offender. It was a man who had once passed judgment on others from one of the highest benches in the land. The contrast between Delisle's public image and the accusations against him created a tension that would persist throughout the trial. By the time court was ready to hear the evidence in 2012, the facts of the case had been scrutinized in media reports, dissected in public debates, and whispered about in legal circles. But inside the courtroom, away from speculation, the story would be told in its starkest form, through testimony, evidence, and the confrontation between two opposing versions of the truth. The trial was about to begin, and the first steps would set the tone for what was to follow. In a case where appearances had already proven deceptive, each piece of evidence, each witness statement, and each legal maneuver would matter. The question of what truly happened on that November morning in 2009 was far from settled, and the answer would hinge on whose story the jury believed. The trial of Jacques Delisle began in 2012, attracting an audience far beyond the walls of the Quebec Superior Court. The proceedings carried a weight rarely seen in Canadian legal history. It was not just the nature of the crime that captured attention, it was the identity of the accused. Here was a man who had once commanded the authority of the bench, now seated at the defense table, facing charges that could end his life in freedom. The case unfolded like a slow, deliberate unmasking. From the very start, the prosecution laid out a narrative built on a combination of motive, opportunity, and science. They reminded the jury that Delisle's wife, Marie-Nicole Rainville, was in a vulnerable state. A woman in her late 70s, partially paralyzed from a stroke, dependent on her husband for even the most basic tasks. They described a marriage that had grown distant, strained by illness, and eroded by infidelity. The prosecution claimed Delisle had been involved with a younger woman, a relationship that symbolized freedom from his responsibilities at home. In their version of events, the decision to kill was not sudden. They portrayed Delisle as a man who had weighed the options and decided that his wife's death would solve the problems he no longer wished to endure. Their key witness was science itself. Forensic evidence that, according to the Crown, eliminated the possibility of suicide. The ballistic analysis was meticulous. Experts testified about the gunshot's trajectory, showing diagrams and reconstructions to the court. The shot had been fired at a close range, but the angle and positioning were such that it would have been extremely difficult for Marie-Nicole to pull the trigger herself. Her right side, the dominant side, was weakened by paralysis, and the mechanics of holding and firing the weapon in the way suggested by the wound were, in the expert's opinion, physically implausible. The gunshot residue patterns told another part of the story. The distribution of residue on her hands did not match what would typically be seen in a suicide. The prosecution argued that these physical details were not minor inconsistencies. They were fundamental contradictions to the defense's narrative. The Crown also brought up Delisle's conduct in the days leading up to the shooting. They introduced evidence showing his continued involvement with the younger woman, suggesting his desire to be free of his marriage was not speculative but active and pressing. They implied that his wife's death cleared the way for a life unburdened by caregiving or marital obligations. The defense countered with their own set of arguments. They acknowledged the couple's difficulties but insisted that the tragedy was the result of Marie-Nicole's own decision. They described her as a woman worn down by illness, trapped in a body that no longer served her. They painted her as mentally exhausted. Her quality of life diminished to the point where she saw no future worth living. In their telling, the physical evidence was open to interpretation, and the prosecution's experts were presenting possibilities as if they were certainties. Defense counsel pressed the point that no one had witnessed the shooting, and without direct proof of Jacques pulling the trigger, the case rested on circumstantial grounds. They questioned the methodology of the forensic tests, suggested alternative explanations for the residue, and reminded the jury that reasonable doubt was enough to acquit. As testimony continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Each witness added a piece to a puzzle that was far from complete in the minds of those listening. The jurors were presented with contrasting portraits. One of a calculating husband who used his wife's vulnerability against her, and another of a man wrongly accused of a crime born from an act of despair by his spouse. The turning point of the trial came when the Crown's forensic ballistics expert delivered his conclusions in plain, unequivocal terms. Using a combination of photographs, diagrams, and demonstrations, he explained why the evidence contradicted suicide. He detailed how the angle of entry and the trajectory through the skull were inconsistent with self-infliction, especially by someone with limited mobility in one arm. His testimony was technical, but it was also clear, and it landed with impact. This moment was pivotal because it crystallized the prosecution's argument into something tangible. Jurors could visualize the impossibility being described. It was not simply theory, it was presented as the only logical explanation once the science was considered. From that point forward, the defense faced a steeper climb. Despite this, they maintained their line of reasoning. They continued to emphasize the absence of direct evidence and tried to introduce doubt about the reliability of the forensic conclusions. They called their own experts to suggest that the limitations in her mobility did not make suicide impossible, only difficult. They stressed that Marie Nicole's emotional state had been fragile, and that the weight of living with her disability could have pushed her toward such a final act. Throughout the proceedings, Jacques Delisle himself was a restrained figure. Observers noted his composed demeanor, his careful attention to testimony, and his limited outward reactions. It was the composure of someone well acquainted with courtroom dynamics, but this time the stakes were personal. The public followed every development closely. Media outlets reported on each day's testimony, and legal analysts weighed in on the strength of the evidence. For many, the case was more than a question of guilt or innocence. It was a test of whether the law could be applied equally to someone who had once been entrusted with upholding it. As the trial moved toward its final stages, both sides prepared for their closing arguments. The prosecution would remind the jury that the combination of motive, opportunity, and forensic evidence formed a consistent, damning picture. The defense would argue that the Crown had built a case on interpretations, not incontrovertible facts, and that doubt still lingered over the most critical question of all: who fired the gun? In the end, the jurors would be asked to weigh science against speculation, character against circumstance, and decide whether a man who had once judged others was now guilty of the most serious crime under Canadian law. The courtroom was set for the final act, but the resolution, and the truth as the jury would see it, remained just beyond the horizon. The verdict, along with any confession or sentencing, would come later. For now, the trial's momentum carried all involved toward a conclusion that no one could yet predict with certainty. The final days of the trial drew the attention of a country that had been watching closely since the charges were first announced. By now, the jurors had heard every piece of evidence, every forensic explanation, and every counter-argument. What remained was for each side to present their closing statements, summaries designed to leave lasting impressions that could sway the verdict one way or the other. The prosecution began by revisiting the central elements of their case. They spoke plainly, reminding the jury of the sequence of events leading up to November 12, 2009. They emphasized the strained marriage, the impact of Marie Nicole Rainville's declining health, and Jacques Delisle's relationship with a younger woman. They made it clear that they believed this was a killing born not from sudden rage but from calculation, a deliberate decision made to escape a life that had become a burden. They returned to the forensic evidence, calling it the silent witness that had no reason to lie. The ballistics and gunshot residue patterns, they argued, formed a narrative that pointed only to homicide. They asked the jury to remember the testimony about the trajectory of the bullet and the physical limitations Marie Nicole faced after her stroke. She could not have done this to herself, the Crown said. Only one person was present, and only one person could have fired that shot. The defense countered with a firm appeal to the principle of reasonable doubt. They acknowledged the tragedy of Marie Nicole's death, but maintained that it was a suicide, driven by the loss of independence and the daily pain of living with paralysis. They argued that the prosecution's story was built on interpretation rather than proof. No one had seen the shooting, no video or audio existed, and the physical evidence could be read in more than one way. They asked the jury not to convict a man on what they called possibilities disguised as certainties. When deliberations began, the jurors carried with them the weight of a decision that would make history. They considered the human aspects, the failing health of the victim, the long career of the accused, the breakdown of a marriage, and the cold, precise details of the forensic evidence. Hours turned into days as they worked through each question the case raised. Ultimately, the verdict was unanimous. In June 2012, the jury found Jacques Delisle guilty of first-degree murder. The decision reverberated beyond the courtroom. It was the first time in Canadian history that a judge had been convicted of murder. The announcement made headlines nationwide and stirred conversations in legal, political, and public circles. The sentencing followed the rules of Canadian law for first-degree murder. Life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. There was no leeway, no alternative outcome. For a man who had once imposed sentences on others, it was now his turn to face the finality of the court's decision. In the moments after the verdict, observers noted that Delisle remained composed. Years in the judiciary had trained him to control his expressions in the courtroom, but this time it was his own freedom that had been taken away. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of Canadian law would now serve his days behind bars. The reaction to the conviction was mixed. Some saw it as a victory for justice, proof that the law could be applied without fear or favor, even to those who had once been part of the system's upper ranks. Others struggled with the idea that a respected judge, a man who had built a career on legal principles, could be capable of such a crime. In the months that followed, the case continued to be discussed and analyzed. Legal commentators examined the trial's key moments, often returning to the forensic testimony that had served as the turning point. The evidence about the trajectory and mechanics of the shooting was cited repeatedly as the factor that had sealed the Crown's case. The affair with the younger woman, while not proof on its own, had provided the motive the prosecution needed to tie the narrative together. Beyond the legal world, the case touched on broader questions about caregiving, aging, and the pressures that come when one partner becomes entirely dependent on the other. While most couples faced with such challenges never turn to violence, the Delisle case became an extreme example of what can happen when resentment, desire for freedom, and opportunity collide. The conviction also served as a stark reminder that professional status and past accomplishments do not place anyone above the law. If anything, the public expected more from someone who had once held the power to decide the fates of others. In that light, the fall from grace was especially severe. In the years since, the name Jacques Delisle has been permanently marked by the case. His long career in the judiciary is overshadowed by the crime for which he was convicted. The apartment in Quebec City where Marie-Nicole Rainville lost her life is remembered not as a home, but as the scene of a crime that shook the country's faith in one of its institutions. For those who followed the trial from start to finish, the memory remains vivid. They recall the slow build of the Crown's case, the pivotal moment when the forensic expert dismantled the suicide theory, and the defense's persistent efforts to plant seeds of doubt. They remember the silence in the courtroom when the verdict was read, and the weight of the sentence that followed. The story of Jacques Delisle is one of betrayal on multiple levels: betrayal of a spouse, betrayal of personal vows, and betrayal of the public trust. It is a case where the themes of premeditation, moral collapse, and the corruption of authority intersect in a way that is rare in Canadian criminal history. And yet, for all the drama and scandal, the essence of the case comes down to a simple truth. A woman's life was taken, and the court concluded it was taken deliberately. No matter the complexity of the forensic evidence, the legal arguments, or the historical significance, the heart of the matter remained with Marie-Nicole Rainville, a victim whose voice could not be heard, but whose story was told through the careful work of those who sought justice on her behalf. By the time the case concluded, the public had their answer. The trial had run its course, the evidence had been weighed, and the sentence had been delivered. Jacques Delisle would spend the rest of his years in prison, carrying with him the knowledge that his name would forever be linked not to the judgments he once rendered, but to the crime that ended his wife's life and destroyed his own.
In 2005, a routine day in an Atlanta courtroom exploded into chaos when a defendant on trial for rape overpowered a deputy, stole her gun, and unleashed deadly violence. Judges, officers, and civilians became targets, sparking a manhunt that gripped the nation and ended in an unforgettable twist. On the morning of March 11, 2005, the Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, was beginning its day like any other. Judges, attorneys, clerks, deputies, and court reporters moved through the marble halls, ready for another round of hearings and trials. Among the cases on the docket that day was a high-profile trial of 33-year-old Brian Nichols, a former college football player who now stood accused of a series of violent crimes, including the brutal assault and kidnapping of his former girlfriend. The trial had drawn attention not only because of the charges, but because Nichols had maintained his innocence and carried himself with a quiet but intense demeanor in the courtroom. Presiding over the case was Judge Roland W. Barnes, a man in his late 60s, well respected in Atlanta's legal community. Judge Barnes had built a reputation for fairness and patience on the bench, often taking the time to explain his reasoning to defendants and making sure court proceedings were conducted with dignity. To those who worked with him daily, he was a steady presence, calm, measured, and deeply committed to the rule of law. Seated near him that morning would be 40-something court reporter Julie and Brandau, an experienced professional whose job was to capture every spoken word for the official record. In the hallways and courtrooms, other staff members and deputies moved about, among them Deputy Cynthia Hall, a woman in her mid-50s with years of experience in courthouse security. Nichols' trial was serious enough that he was considered a high-risk defendant. He was being held without bond in the Fulton County Jail and transported to court each day under guard. On this morning, he was brought from the jail to the courthouse for what was expected to be another day of testimony. Deputy Hall was tasked with escorting him from the holding cell area to the courtroom. Nichols was unshackled, standard procedure in many trials to prevent jurors from seeing a defendant restrained, which could influence their perception of guilt. It was in a small holding area, away from public view, where the day took its first violent turn. Nichols, tall and physically fit, waited for his moment. As Deputy Hall prepared to move him, he suddenly attacked. The assault was swift and brutal. Nichols overpowered her, beating her severely until she was unable to fight back. In the chaos, he took her firearm, his first deadly advantage. Hall was left badly injured on the floor, and Nichols now had a loaded weapon in his hands. With the stolen gun, Nichols made his way toward Judge Barnes' courtroom. He knew the layout well from previous appearances and moved quickly before anyone could raise the alarm. At around 9 a.m., as proceedings were either about to start or just getting underway, Nichols burst into the courtroom. Witnesses would later describe the scene as instantaneous and terrifying. No warning, no demands, just gunfire. Judge Barnes, seated at the bench, had no chance to react. Nichols shot him at close range, killing him almost instantly. Court reporter Julie and Brandau was also in the line of fire. Nichols turned the weapon toward her and shot, killing her where she sat. The calm formality of the courtroom was shattered in seconds. Papers flew, chairs scraped the floor, and people tried to scramble for cover. Nichols' rampage inside the courthouse wasn't over. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, he encountered another deputy and fired, leaving more victims behind as he made his way out. Outside the courtroom, panic spread quickly through the building. Attorneys, staff, and civilians rushed to lock doors or find safe spots to hide. Law enforcement officers inside the courthouse tried to locate the shooter, but Nichols had already begun his escape. Using stairwells and service areas, he avoided the main security points and slipped out into the streets of downtown Atlanta. Nichols' escape was a nightmare scenario. An armed man who had just murdered a judge and a court reporter was now free in a busy metropolitan area. The streets around the courthouse became a scene of chaos as officers arrived in force, sirens blaring, and tried to establish a perimeter. But Nichols was already moving with purpose. Sometime during his flight, he came across U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent David Wilhelm. Nichols shot and killed Wilhelm, then stole his badge, service weapon, and vehicle. Now in possession of 2 guns, a law enforcement ID, and transportation, Nichols had gained both mobility and a dangerous disguise. Atlanta went into lockdown. Government offices, schools, and businesses were alerted. Law enforcement agencies, from the local police to the FBI, became involved in the manhunt. The image of Brian Nichols, tall, muscular, and now armed with multiple weapons, was broadcast across television screens and radios throughout the city and beyond. Roadblocks were set up, officers went door to door in some neighborhoods, and helicopters scanned from above. The fear was palpable. Nichols had already shown he was willing to kill without hesitation, and no one knew where he might strike next. Back at the courthouse, the reality of what had just happened was beginning to set in. Judge Roland Barnes, a respected pillar of the legal system, was gone. Court reporter Julie and Brandau, whose work preserved the official history of the court's decisions, was dead. Deputy Cynthia Hall lay in a hospital, clinging to life with severe injuries. And Agent David Wilhelm, who had been going about his day, was killed in his own home during what should have been an ordinary morning. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of events, interviewing witnesses who had seen Nichols before and after the shootings. They learned that his attack on Deputy Hall had been a calculated opportunity. He had likely been looking for the right moment to make his move. His knowledge of courthouse procedures and layout had allowed him to navigate the building and escape before a coordinated response could be mounted. The city's residents were gripped by a mixture of shock and fear. The Fulton County Courthouse, a place symbolizing law, order, and justice, had been transformed into a crime scene of extraordinary violence. Even seasoned law enforcement officers admitted the attack was unlike anything they had seen in their careers. For Nichols, the escape was not just about avoiding conviction. It was about reclaiming control in the most extreme and destructive way possible. For the people of Atlanta, it was a stark reminder that even the most secure institutions could be breached in moments. By late afternoon, the search had extended well beyond the immediate area. Nichols had abandoned Wilhelm's stolen vehicle and disappeared into the sprawling neighborhoods of the Atlanta metropolitan area. Detectives followed up on leads, but each sighting seemed to evaporate before they could close in. Nichols had managed to vanish, at least for the time being, leaving a city on edge and a trail of grief in his wake. This was only the first day of what would become one of the most infamous manhunts in Georgia's history. The murders inside the courthouse and the killing of an ICE agent were only the beginning of a story that would grip the city for the next 24 hours, testing the resolve of law enforcement and the nerves of the public, and ending in a way few could have predicted. The events of that morning had already changed lives forever, and the city of Atlanta was bracing for whatever would come next. As the sun dipped lower over Atlanta on March 11, 2005, the streets of the city felt tense and uneasy. Word of the courthouse shootings had spread fast, and the image of Brian Nichols, a tall, athletic man with close-cropped hair and a piercing gaze, was everywhere. Police cruisers and unmarked vehicles sped through intersections, officers clutching radios as they coordinated the widening manhunt. Helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights cutting through the fading daylight. Nichols had vanished into the urban sprawl, and every hour that passed without a sighting made him seem more elusive, more dangerous. Inside the Fulton County Sheriff's Office and the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, command centers were buzzing with activity. Local officers were joined by state troopers, federal agents, and members of specialized task forces. Nichols had already shown that he was willing to kill without hesitation. Judge Roland Barnes in his own courtroom, court reporter Julie and Brandau, as she worked, and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent David Wilhelm in the safety of his home. With Deputy Cynthia Hall gravely injured in the hospital, there was no question. Nichols was armed, desperate, and unpredictable. The investigation quickly confirmed that after killing Agent Wilhelm, Nichols had taken Wilhelm's government-issued pistol, badge, and pickup truck. For hours, the stolen vehicle was his means of moving unnoticed, blending into traffic, while officers searched the wrong streets. When they finally located the truck, abandoned in a parking structure, Nichols had already melted away into the city. As night settled in, Nichols relied on his instincts and a willingness to approach strangers for help. Moving carefully, he looked for places to rest, to find food, and to figure out his next move. But the city was on high alert. Every news channel, every radio station, and even scrolling electronic billboards displayed his photo. Police urged residents to lock their doors, stay inside, and report anything suspicious. Nichols, however, had something many fugitives lacked, a calm demeanor that allowed him to talk his way into or out of situations, at least for short periods. In the hours after abandoning the stolen truck, Nichols encountered several people. Some would later admit they had uneasy feelings about him, but didn't immediately recognize who he was. He moved through parking lots, apartment complexes, and side streets, staying on the edges of crowds, avoiding heavily policed areas. By this point, his face was known to millions, but in the dim light of night and without his jail clothes, he could pass for a man simply going about his business. Law enforcement was under immense pressure. The murders of a sitting judge and a federal agent in a single day was unprecedented in Georgia's modern history. Leaders from the governor's office down to the smallest precinct wanted results, and they wanted them quickly. The city's resources were stretched thin, hundreds of officers on overtime, K-9 units searching buildings, SWAT teams on standby. Detectives retraced Nichols' steps from the courthouse to Wilhelm's home and beyond, mapping out the sequence of events to predict where he might go next. Still, Nichols stayed a step ahead, aided by the randomness of his movements and his ability to adapt on the fly. Meanwhile, survivors and witnesses from the courthouse were still reeling. Attorneys and staff who had been inside Judge Barnes' courtroom were giving statements, describing the gunshots, the chaos, and the terror of seeing a man turn on them with lethal force. Some were still in shock, unable to fully process that a respected judge had been murdered in the very room where the law was supposed to be upheld. The emotional weight on courthouse staff was immense. Many had worked closely with Judge Barnes and Julie Brandau for years. For Deputy Hall's colleagues, the knowledge that she was fighting for her life in the hospital added another layer of urgency to the hunt for Nichols. Late in the night, Nichols found himself near an apartment complex in Duluth, a suburb northeast of Atlanta. There, fate would bring him into contact with Ashley Smith, a 26-year-old widow and mother. Smith had just returned home from a late-night trip when Nichols confronted her in the parking lot. Brandishing his gun, he forced her to let him inside her apartment. This moment marked a dangerous new chapter in his flight. Inside, Smith was terrified, but quickly understood that her survival depended on remaining calm and finding a way to humanize herself in Nichols' eyes. Over the next several hours, the two sat in her apartment while Nichols alternated between talking and brooding. Smith listened, speaking only when it felt safe, trying to appeal to the part of him that might be tired of running. At one point, she offered him food, pancakes, eggs, and bacon, buying herself time and possibly lowering his guard. Nichols spoke about his life, his frustrations, and the trial that had led him to this point. He told Smith he felt cornered, that his situation had spiraled beyond what he had imagined when he overpowered Deputy Hall earlier that day. Smith, searching for any lifeline, turned to her faith. She read to Nichols from a religious book she had in her home, using the words to encourage him to think about surrender, about ending the violence without more deaths. Back outside, the manhunt pressed on. Officers combed through tip lines, chasing down reported sightings that took them from gas stations to rural roads to busy intersections. Every unmarked car in the area had Nichols' photo on the passenger seat, ready to be shown to anyone who might have seen him. Still, the city's 24-hour news coverage was becoming a double-edged sword. While it kept the public aware and watchful, it also meant Nichols knew exactly how much attention was on him and how desperate the police were to find him. Through the night and into the early hours of March 12th, Nichols remained in Ashley Smith's apartment. She continued to talk with him, to offer him small acts of kindness without letting her guard down. Gradually, Nichols' tone began to change. The adrenaline from the previous day's violence was wearing off, replaced by the weight of what he had done and the inevitability of capture. By morning, the standoff between the fugitive and his unwilling host reached a turning point. Smith convinced Nichols that surrendering was his best chance to survive, that he could avoid more bloodshed and perhaps explain his side in court. She told him the police would find him eventually, and that if he went out on his own terms, he could at least control how it ended. Nichols, after hours of evading hundreds of officers, seemed to waver. Outside, law enforcement remained unaware of exactly where Nichols was, but the search perimeter had tightened. Patrol cars circled neighborhoods, plainclothes officers mingled with morning pedestrians, and tactical teams were staged nearby in case he was spotted. The city was exhausted, yet the adrenaline of possibly catching him kept the operation moving at full pace. Ashley Smith's apartment was quiet in those final moments before daylight. Nichols, still armed and still dangerous, had a choice to make. He had killed a judge, a court reporter, and a federal agent, and severely injured a deputy in less than 24 hours. His actions had paralyzed one of the largest cities in the Southeast, triggering one of the most intense manhunts in state history. Now, with police closing in and nowhere left to run, the decision of how this would end rested entirely in his hands. The next hours would determine whether the case concluded in more violence or with Nichols finally in custody. For the people of Atlanta, still holding their breath, the hope was simple, that no one else would die before this was over. The morning of March 12, 2005, began with a kind of tense quiet in Atlanta. For nearly 24 hours, Brian Nichols had managed to evade one of the largest manhunts in Georgia's history. The murders of Judge Roland W. Barnes, court reporter Julie and Brandau, and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent David Wilhelm had left the city shaken. The brutal beating of Deputy Cynthia Hall, who remained in critical condition, was a grim reminder of just how much violence Nichols was capable of. Law enforcement knew the fugitive was still armed, still dangerous, and still somewhere in the Atlanta area. What they didn't know was that he was sitting in the apartment of Ashley Smith, the woman he had taken hostage the night before. Smith, a 26-year-old widow and mother, had spent the long night trying to keep herself alive through conversation, calmness, and empathy. Nichols, after forcing his way in at gunpoint, had settled into her apartment, eating breakfast she cooked for him and talking about his life. She had listened to his anger and frustration, but also looked for ways to plant seeds of surrender in his mind. She read to him from a religious book she kept in her home, telling him that he still had a chance to make a different choice. She reminded him that he had a son, a mother, and a family, and that killing more people would only bring more pain. As dawn broke, Nichols began to soften. The adrenaline from his escape and rampage was fading, replaced by fatigue and a dawning realization that he could not run forever. He paced the apartment, speaking more slowly, and the aggression in his voice began to fade. Smith sensed the shift and pressed her advantage. She told him plainly that she could call the police for him, that if he surrendered peacefully, there might still be a chance to tell his side of the story in court. Nichols didn't commit right away, but he didn't shut her down either. It was the first real sign that he was considering the possibility of ending this without more bloodshed. Outside, Atlanta was beginning to stir. The manhunt had entered its second day, and officers from multiple agencies were combing through tips and sightings. Patrol cars rolled slowly through neighborhoods, tactical teams stayed staged nearby, and helicopters once again took to the air. The public was still on edge, but there was also a growing sense that the man who had terrorized the city might finally be cornered. Inside Smith's apartment, the hours ticked by. Nichols' mood shifted between quiet reflection and short bursts of nervous energy. He handled his weapon, set it down, picked it up again. Smith stayed calm, offering him coffee and talking to him about ordinary things, her daughter, her job, her late husband. Every moment she kept him engaged in conversation was another moment without violence. Eventually, she asked if she could leave to see her daughter. To her relief, Nichols agreed, a sign that his grip on the situation was loosening. Once outside, Smith moved quickly. She contacted police and told them exactly where Nichols was. Within minutes, heavily armed officers were converging on the area. They set up a perimeter around the apartment complex and quietly moved into position. Negotiators were prepared in case Nichols resisted, but the hope was that he would honor the decision he had been leaning toward all morning, to surrender without a fight. At around 9:50 a.m., law enforcement officers made their move. They surrounded the apartment and called out to Nichols. For a tense moment, no one knew what he would do. Then, to the relief of everyone on scene, Nichols emerged with his hands up. He was taken into custody without any shots fired, ending a manhunt that had gripped Atlanta and much of the nation for 2 straight days. Officers found multiple firearms on him, including the guns stolen from Deputy Hall and Agent Wilhelm. The arrest marked the close of one of the most violent fugitive chases in Georgia's modern history. News of Nichols' capture spread quickly. Atlanta residents, who had spent the previous day in fear, could finally exhale. The headlines that morning were filled with images of Nichols in custody, flanked by armed officers, his face still showing the defiance that had carried him through his escape. But for the families of his victims, relief was tempered by grief. Judge Barnes, remembered for his fairness and humanity on the bench, would never return to his courtroom. Julian Brandau's meticulous transcripts and bright presence were gone forever. Agent Wilhelm's dedication to public service had been cut short by a senseless act of violence. And Deputy Hall faced a long, painful recovery from the injuries she had sustained doing her job. In the weeks that followed, the case moved toward trial. The evidence against Nichols was overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts from the courthouse, ballistic matches from the murder weapons, and a trail of stolen property linking him to every crime scene. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, arguing that the killings were deliberate, calculated, and part of an escape that showed no regard for human life. Nichols' defense team prepared to argue that his actions were driven by panic and a belief that he would not get a fair trial on the original rape charges. The trial was long and complex, attracting national media coverage. Security at the courthouse was unprecedented: metal detectors, armed guards, and controlled access for all attendees. The testimony was harrowing. Survivors recounted the sounds of gunfire in Judge Barnes' courtroom, the chaos of people diving for cover, and the shock of realizing that the judge had been shot dead at his bench. Law enforcement officers described the massive operation to locate Nichols, detailing the hundreds of tips, false leads, and tense moments when they thought they might have him. And Ashley Smith took the stand to recount the night she spent as Nichols' hostage, explaining how she tried to appeal to his humanity and convince him to surrender. When Nichols himself took the stand, he admitted to the killings, but portrayed them as the desperate acts of a man who felt cornered and hopeless. He spoke of fearing a long prison sentence and claimed he never planned to harm so many people. But under cross-examination, prosecutors pressed him on the fact that each killing was intentional, each victim deliberately targeted or shot. The jury saw a man who had choices at every stage and chose violence every time. In December 2008, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Nichols was found guilty on all counts, including multiple counts of murder, aggravated assault, armed robbery, and kidnapping. The sentencing phase that followed was emotional and intense, with family members of the victims addressing the court. Many spoke of the lasting pain and emptiness caused by Nichols' actions, and of the irreplaceable loss of lives that had been dedicated to public service. In the end, the jury spared Nichols the death penalty, opting instead for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision meant that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, never again able to harm anyone outside prison walls. For some, the sentence was a measure of justice. For others, it felt too lenient given the scope of his crimes. The case left a lasting impact on courthouse security across the United States. In Georgia, new procedures were implemented to ensure that defendants in high-risk cases remained under constant guard, even when appearing before a jury. The tragedy served as a grim reminder of the dangers faced by those who work in the justice system and the need for vigilance in protecting them. For the city of Atlanta, the events of March 11th and 12th, 2005, would never be forgotten. The courthouse where the killings occurred continued to operate, but the memories of that day lingered in its halls. In courtrooms across the country, the story of Brian Nichols became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly control can be lost, and how devastating the consequences can be when violence breaches the walls of justice. And for those who had been there, for the families of Judge Roland Barnes, Julie and Brandau, and Agent David Wilhelm, and for Deputy Cynthia Hall, the wounds remained long after the headlines faded. Nichols' surrender had ended the immediate danger, but it could never undo the harm he had caused. What remained was the long, difficult work of healing, in a city forever marked by the day a courtroom turned into a crime scene.